Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the very first DVpit Live. I'm here with a wonderful panel, and I'm just going to introduce them really quickly, and then we are going to get straight into some really great questions. So first we have John Cusick. He is a literary agent at Folio Junior, Folio Literary Management. Quressa Robinson, literary agent at Nelson Literary, and Stacy Whitman, who is a publisher at 2 Books, an imprint of Lee & Low Books. And me, I am Claribel Ortega. I am a YA MG author, and I am the moderator tonight. So, hello, everyone. All right, so we're going to jump right into the questions. Anyone can just answer in whatever order you guys want to. So can you tell us more about what gets your attention in a submission? What makes the difference between, sure, I'll request and read it when I have time, and I must drop everything and read right now?
Well, I would say for me, you know, when I'm reading queries, I always read the pitch first, and the pitch kind of tells me if I'm going to go on to read the sample pages, because I think that concept is so very important, especially when you're deciding whether or not to take on like a young adult or a middle grade project. So the first thing I'm looking for is there something about the story or the story idea that feels really original and fresh? So if it's something that feels like I haven't seen this before, this feels like a really new spin on a familiar idea, that's the kind of thing that's really going to make me excited to jump right to those sample pages and see, you know, what the style of the voice is like.
Okay.
I'm actually exactly the opposite. I actually don't even read the cover letter, and we actually do cover letter plus first 3 chapters for all our unagented submissions. And personally, I look at the writing first, and if the writing doesn't grab me, I kind of feel like the concept doesn't matter. So, and then if the writing grabs me, then I go back and I look at the concept. But then what John said applies also, because they do go hand in hand.
Right. It's got to be both. That's for sure.
Yeah, for me, it's often I do read the query letter first. And so I think for me, it's always if I find something that I didn't know I wanted or I didn't know I needed. So if there's something in the query letter that feels like really special, that makes me want to be more excited about reading the sample pages, because we usually request sample pages with the query letter, and it's usually about 10 pages. So if the query letter makes me feel like I need to read the sample pages right now, I really hope this concept holds up in the writing, and then the writing is amazing, then I'm going to want to request that manuscript right away because I want to read it right away.
Okay. That all makes sense. So what makes the difference between an R&R and a pass and an R&R and an offer of rep or publication for you?
What do you mean by R&R?
A revise and resubmit.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Sorry.
I mean, you know, I'll go first. I'll say that I very rarely ask for a revise and resubmit. Usually, you know, for a lot of projects that I end up requesting, it's usually a pretty competitive atmosphere where there are a lot of agents asking for it at once. And I assume it's usually the case that the author would have an agent who is willing to take them on without a revision. You know, and I think it can be tricky. I think that typically I'm looking for a manuscript that isn't necessarily perfect, but it's far enough along that I have confidence that the author can get it to where it needs to be. You know, what I may sometimes do is if there's a concept that I really love or a voice that I really love and it's just not quite there, it's not something I can take on, I will pass with a few notes, and I'll say, you know, if you have something else, or if you end up revising down the line and you'd like to come back to me, you know, I'd be delighted to see this again. But I usually don't ask an author to sort of, you know, withdraw their sub and do a revision just for me. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. I find that to be a bit of a hard road to make work, both for myself and for the author.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, same for me. I've never officially or formally requested a revise and resubmit. It's usually if I feel something is almost there, I'll give the author notes and ask them to send it to me if they decide to revise. But beyond that, I've never done an official revise and resubmit.
For me, I used to do it a lot. But it honestly, for publishers, it's becoming more competitive now too. More publishers are seeking diverse books because, you know, what I do, everything I publish is diverse. And so sometimes I had the luxury when it wasn't as competitive to take the time to develop somebody who has some potential but maybe isn't quite ready yet. And it's getting more competitive now, so I'm actually more likely to acquire somebody who has potential earlier in the process, because I want to snap up the good writers, even if it takes a little bit, you know, more time for us to get really ready to publish. But there are times, and it's just so individual to all the things that need to come together. For us at Lee & Low, we're very trade books in the educational market oriented. So I'm looking for things that really hit those what teachers are looking for, what will work with the curriculum, but also has a commercial concept. So if I see that the voice is there, but maybe we're going to need more work on plot or more work on characterization, that's when I'll probably try and develop it a little bit more, because it's harder for an editor to help the author fix voice. I think that is something that the author has to develop more independently before it's ready to go to an editor. But everything else I can work with, you know, and then it just depends on if it's hitting everything else that we need, then we're more likely to move quickly.
Okay. So speaking of moving quickly, the Twitter feed moves very quickly on pitch days. What makes you stop and favorite or retweet, you know, a pitch? And do you have any tips for authors that are going to be pitching during DVpit?
It is so hard to get that into 140 characters. So I completely sympathize with somebody trying to figure out how to put that together. For me, what I just said about hitting the educational appeal and the commercial appeal at once is what immediately makes me. So for example, I can't think of any one in particular, but there were several pitches the last time that immediately said that is a YA that had some sort of historical hook, but had a commercial aspect to it, like maybe it was time travel or science fiction or something like that combined, that I would be like, oh, okay, this is something that could be right up our alley.
I think that DVpit feed does go by so quickly, and there are so many folks pitching in it that it's a little bit like jumping into an ocean and just trying to grab things as they swim by. You know, you're never going to get the whole, you're never going to get to see everything or know that you've seen every pitch that you want to see. But I think that my suggestion is always for authors to try and be as specific as possible as they can in that tweet. So for instance, you know, you could have an amazing project, and if you pitch it as like, a girl goes on a quest and, you know, might risk everything she's ever loved, that could be an amazing book, but there's no way for me to distinguish that from other fantasy stories. So, you know, if you say like a girl journeys to the center of the earth to risk her, you know, lover's ESP crystals, suddenly that's, I can wrap my head around it, as, you know, like it feels
specific.
Like, yeah, exactly. It's specific. So if it's something I'll want, I'll know because of those specific details. So I think trying to work those in really can benefit the writer.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think don't be nervous if you don't get a lot of hits immediately. A lot of us don't necessarily hang out all day. Some of us come in and out, or maybe even just hang out towards the end of the pitch day and go back and kind of read the hashtag to find things that we like. And since I do lean towards sci-fi fantasy, I agree that leading with how your story is unique or special or fresh is what you should do in your pitch.
Yeah,
and I would add,
oh, go ahead.
Could I also add, like, just housekeeping wise, if you use hashtags like hashtag YA or hashtag MG or hashtag SFF or those kinds of things, it can save you time and also make it more searchable for us, because I might go on and search hashtag DVpit, hashtag YA, so that I can narrow it down a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
As I wanted to just give an author's perspective, because I really super agree with everything that you guys said. And for me, the pitches that worked best were the ones where I really focused on what made my manuscript unique, and what made it stand out. So my main character is a punk and she is a witch, and I tried to make sure that that was in my tweets because it really stood out. You're not really seeing a lot of that combination of a character. So absolutely, that's amazing advice, and it worked for me. So
Yeah.
proven theory. Okay, so we're on to our next question. So debut YA novelist Amina May Safi found her agent through DVpit, and has since sold her book to Fuel. But her pitches broke almost every rule of pitching. She had gifts, she had polls, she had jokes. So why do you think her out-of-the-box tweets worked? And do you think other authors should follow suit?
So I'm 50-50 on this, because on the one hand, I feel like her tweets were amazing and really grabbing. Like, you know, we're talking about how do you stand out from the pack. So on the one hand, I think she did it really successfully. But I think as a general rule for pitching or for querying, my advice is usually to try and avoid sort of gimmicks, and to kind of let your work speak for itself as much as possible. Only because, you know, I think as well, I'll speak for, you know, agents. I think reading queries, we've seen so many queries, we get so many per day, that we've probably like heard every joke and sort of seen a lot of the gimmicks already. So you really want to know that if you're standing out, you're standing out for a good reason. Like I feel like at least once a day I have someone write to me that they're going to blow Harry Potter out of the water. And like so many people have that same joke. So I think, you know, you want to be actually original, and that's hard to do. So my general advice is usually to try and, you know, have that really unique story idea. Like Claribel, you were saying, you know, with the punk witch, like that's really original and different. And all you have to do is say punk witch, and that's interesting enough, you know?
Yeah, and I think if it feels like a gimmick and comes across as a gimmick, then it probably is too gimmicky. Like, it has to feel natural to your voice and what you're doing as an author. And I think why it worked for her is because it didn't feel like a gimmick. It felt authentic. So if it isn't feeling authentic or natural, then just don't do it.
I completely agree. I think about Daniel Jose Older is kind of the king of GIFs on Twitter. and if you can be that skilled at using a GIF, that's wonderful. If your pitch involves, you know, that kind of skill. And I think when you're talking about your pitch, if you don't have the skills to tell a joke, then don't rely on it to hook somebody. Rely on your content to hook somebody, like what you were saying about punk witches.
Okay. So what are some of the common mistakes that authors make when sending their queries and their first pages after getting a like on Twitter? Anybody?
I would say for me, the first DVpit, I actually had someone send me a manuscript that didn't fit our submission guidelines. I had liked it because it was part of DVpit. From the pitch, it sounded like the main character was Native American, and it turned out that the main character was not Native American. It didn't involve the local Native American community, but because we only publish books that are diverse and star people of color and Native people, it didn't fit. So make sure that when you're pitching for an event that your book matches what the event is about. And then when you get a like from someone, just making sure to double check those submission guidelines just to be sure that there's no misunderstanding about what they're actually looking for.
I think for me, I think it's not common, but sending the wrong manuscript and query, other than the one I actually liked on DVpit, probably not the best approach.
I sometimes see, and I hate to say this because I think it might be a little bit contentious, but I sometimes see the term own voices used in a way that I think is a little bit off its intent. So, you know, I'll have someone pitch me, and this isn't necessarily something that I've liked through DVpit, but just in the general query inbox, I'll have someone pitch me, you know, an own voices narrative that's like also about a white guy who grew up in Illinois. And I feel like, okay, yes, technically, but I think that's sort of not what the intent of the own voices hashtag is. And that's not to say that that Illinois book isn't awesome. It isn't something that I would like to represent. But I think being clear on what the philosophy is behind that pitching technique is important, you know?
Okay, cool. Yeah, I would say I probably made a lot of silly mistakes when I started querying, but we're not going to talk about those. Move on to the next question. Recently, a conference attendee tweeted that someone on an agent panel advised authors, quote, "Be careful with your opinions on Twitter unless you're Roxanne Gay." What do you think this agent meant by this, and do you agree?
Well, I mean, I think that you're hoping to make a professional connection with an agent or an editor, and it's also invariably there's some personal elements in that as well. So I think that I don't know exactly what that agent was referring to, but my guess is that if someone was actively sort of promoting a certain viewpoint that maybe some agents or editors would find to be a conflict with their own personal ideologies, that could be a turnoff for that professional relationship, right? So I think maybe that's what they meant and we're sort of thinking about. And I don't know, it's tough to say because on the one hand, it is a professional relationship, but on the other hand, I could see being turned off by a writer who said something that I really viscerally disagreed with, you know, philosophically or politically. So I think, you know, there's maybe something to that. But on the other hand, I've had authors who are very vocal on Twitter about what they believe in. And, you know, I've had folks write to me and say like, oh, you know, I don't know, that author was really, you know, vocal about this certain issue. And my feeling is that's their right to, you know, be vocal about whatever they feel, especially when they're, you know, if you're being vocal about standing up for marginalized peoples, for instance, you know, so. Yeah, I feel like I just talked in a whole circle there.
It made sense. It made sense.
Okay.
I mean, I really can't imagine what you would be saying on Twitter that would be so bad unless you're being like hateful or racist. But then again, I would also want to know that you're hateful and racist. So
right.
I don't work with you. I mean, I think I'm pretty opinionated on Twitter. So I don't know. I guess see me as a guide and see if you're, you know, if I don't know. I think just be yourself. Be yourself. Don't worry too much about it. Just be yourself and you'll find the right agent. The right agent will come along.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of like the analogy of submission as dating, I think is applicable here because finding the right match is definitely a good thing. And I don't think that it necessarily means that you and your agent's politics have to line up, but I have heard many authors, particularly authors of color who are vocal about social justice issues, being told, tone it down, you're being too political, that kind of thing. And I think especially now we are in a moment where toning it down just isn't, I don't think that's the right thing to do. I mean, on a human scale. So, but if, for example, I get a submission from a white supremacist, I'd have a problem with publishing that person. So I think it all depends on it being the right match.
So while we're on the subject of Twitter, YA author Nick Stone tweeted recently, "A friend just told me their own voice's manuscript was rejected by an editor because they already have an insert POC book. It was not own voices. So several agents and authors chimed in to add that they've been on the receiving end of similar rejections. Have you received responses like this or experienced other issues when trying to sell or acquire manuscripts with underrepresented characters? And what can we do to try to combat this?
I think this is an industry problem. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I quote tweeted that because, yes, as an editor, I had that issue. I had a couple of books that were by own voices authors that I wanted to acquire that I had got a lot of pushback for. And one of them was Thinly Veiled because we have one like this on our list. So definitely it is an industry issue of not having enough diversity, not having enough people on the other side of the desk to field some of these things. Like we talk a lot about needing more writers of color and from marginalized backgrounds, but we need that in publishing houses too. We need people in the sales department. We need people in publicity and marketing and editorial, and not just at the entry level, but as, executive and senior editors and as publishers, so that a lot of this doesn't happen in the future.
I think it can also depend on the size of the list that you're talking about. I only do 6 books a year, so I try and balance out the list because I don't want to underrepresent anybody. And it's not an overrepresentation thing, but making sure that, for example, I have currently no Muslim authors or main characters on my list, and that's something that I'm actively looking for. So it might look like I'm overlooking some others while I'm actively looking for something else because my list is just so small. And that is a challenge when you're working for a small house, but I don't think that it should be, it's not something that makes me go, well, here's this amazing book, but I've already got, a character from that ethnicity. That's just, no. But it is a challenge when you only have 6 books that you can choose every year.
Yeah, I think what is concerning to me that I've seen as an agent is, particularly with this sort of explosion of own voices fantasy in the past year in terms of books being sold and books coming out. I've gone out with projects where I had, editors tell me, oh, well, we already have so-and-so. And what they meant was we already have a fantasy by an author of the same ethnicity as the author that you're submitting to me. And that was really troubling because to me, that's a kind of tokenism. It's like, well, we've got our Native American fantasy, Latino fantasy, whatever it happens to be, so we don't need another one. Whereas you'll have 10 books come out in a year about like road trips, you know what I mean? Or white kids on road trips, And so, I think that we need to make sure that it's not a trend, so to speak. It's not tokenism where we just every publisher needs to have their own voices fantasy. It's that fantasies need to be written by all different sorts of people from all different backgrounds, and it's not about just sort of checking a box on your big house list. And Stacy, I totally understand where you're coming from. You know what I mean? If you're working with a small list, you want to make sure that you are reaching all these different audiences and all these different authors. But I think if it's a big house, it's a very different atmosphere, right? Yeah.
Well, and I think that what was I going to say? I've lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
If you remember, you can just.
I had a thought and it went away.
Okay, so we all have implicit bias. As such, what advice can you offer writers who identify as marginalized but do not share the same ID as their main character in terms of creating sensitive portrayals?
Cynthia Leidick-Smith, I think, is the person who said, have you held enough of their babies? And I think that's a really great way of thinking about how involved are you with the community. And if you're not already involved with the community that you're writing about, what can you do to become more involved? And it's not just research on paper, but knowing people and having that human connection.
Anything else to
And
add?
definitely get sensitivity readers. Like just because my husband's Mexican American doesn't mean I know everything about being Mexican American. So, get a sensitivity reader to make sure you're not doing anything that's culturally insensitive, and making sure you're representing the culture well.
I agree.
And
Seconded.
And I would and I would just add that sensitivity readers are not just your best friend who happens to be from that culture. It's somebody who we call them at Lee and Low cultural experts for a reason, because they're experts who understand writing as well as the culture. So they can give you good professional feedback.
Yes, I do sensitivity reading for a publisher, and I catch a lot of things that would have been super harmful had they been published in the book. So it's really important. And I would say definitely get a sensitivity reader that knows what they're talking about in terms of that marginalization. Like, if the main character is Mexican American, I'm probably not the best person to do a sensitivity read because I'm from the Caribbean. So just because I speak Spanish doesn't mean that I'm going to know exactly, if there are any things that are harmful in the text. So
we actually had a really interesting situation that I could share an example of, that it is actually an intracultural sensitivity read that we got for Ahimsa, which is a book that's coming out this fall. The author is actually Indian American herself, and she was writing about the freedom movement in India, but it involved the Dalit community as well, which is what many people might know as untouchables. And when you're talking about caste system issues in India, we felt that it was important to have somebody from the Dalit community to also read it. So just because you're from that culture doesn't mean that you're an expert on something. So be considerate about class issues as well, things like that.
Absolutely. So DVpit recently received an anonymous question about trigger warnings. There has been some discussion about whether and how best to include trigger warnings for certain books. Have you seen these warnings in query letters and pitches or books? And do you think the industry should make a concerted effort to make trigger warnings the norm?
I mean, I personally haven't seen any in queries. I mean, sometimes I wish they would have included them, especially when it comes to sexual assault and sexual violence. Like, you read a query and it's not mentioned at all, and then you get the manuscript, and then suddenly there's something happening that you weren't prepared for. And I definitely think that there should be trigger warnings in books, just so that people picking up the book know what they're getting into. I mean, you can't really tell necessarily from the cover copy. So you want the reader to be prepared just in case they need to protect themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think especially in the world of YA, a young adult novel can include all sorts of different content and be very sort of tame and low key, or it can be extremely emotionally intense. There can be sexual violence and there can be racism and all kinds of stuff. So I don't know. I think it's a good idea. I don't see why not. In the same way that you might think of a rating system that we have for games or movies, it's almost just sort of a heads up as the sort of about the sort of content you might encounter within this story. I don't see why not.
I've never seen one in a query or a submission before, but I have seen, I'm blanking on what anthology it was, but it was visible, wasn't too visible. It was right there in the table of contents, that underneath the title for the short story that had a trigger warning, it just said trigger warning. I think it was sexual violence, and it might have been an adult anthology that this was a part of, but I think that it's seamless. If you're looking at the table of contents and paging through deciding which story to start with, it's a great way of just giving a heads up for people who might need that.
Yeah, I've also seen some authors actually putting trigger warnings on their website for their books. So before you get their books, you can just check their website and it'll have a list of trigger warnings that are included in the book itself. And I thought that was pretty cool as well. So So one more question before we go into our speed round. Are there any deal breakers for you when it comes to category limitations or subjects?
I mean, I would say for, you know, for me, young adult is really life in and around high school. So you could have a character that's either recently graduated from high school or is maybe slightly older than the high school age and is having a teenage experience out there in the world somewhere. But if I see a YA submitted to me and it takes place in college, it's not going to be for me. And if, you know, if I did adult or crossover material like some of my colleagues do, maybe it would be sort of a fit for that category. But to me, that's not really a young adult book, even though there are exceptions to that rule.
I agree. I've gotten several submissions that had a lot of potential, but they were, one was a 19-year-old who turned 20 in the book. Several involved college. And when we are selling into the schools, I mean, kids do like to read up, but it just doesn't feel quite the same. It doesn't feel up the alley. For me, it's not, YA doesn't exactly mean high school, but it could mean older junior high into high school, depending on how the school works as well. But that younger YA, older middle grade age group is a little bit, you know, it's nebulous right now anyway. It seems to be changing. But as long as, for us, especially selling into the schools, we do have kind of extreme violence and extreme sexual violence, things like that, and just, you know, sex going all the way, that kind of thing can be hard to sell into the schools. Yet at the same time, it also depends on what age group we're selling it to. So language and stuff like that, high schools don't care as much about that, but junior highs, especially, you know, in the more conservative areas, do care about that. So it just depends on the age group as well that you're talking about.
Okay, so we're going to get into our speed round. So these questions, just answer them really quickly. And then we're going to take some questions from Twitter. So the first question is, if a participant doesn't get an agent in this round, can they participate in the next DVpit with the same manuscript? So according to the rules, they can, yes. Would it deter you guys at all if they pitch the same manuscript in the next DVpit?
Unless I've seen it before, no. Just why not?
Okay. So if an author decides after participating that their novel actually needs more work before it can be sent to the requesting agent or editor, how long can they take? Is 6 months too long? A year?
On the one hand,
I would say a year. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, you can take as long as you want. I mean, we want to see the best version of the book that you can send. But on the other hand, if you write to me and say, you know, I pitched this 5 years ago, and now I just finally finished with it, I will worry about your ability to, like, say, turn out a book a year every 2 years, which is sort of the schedule for a lot of YA publishers. So 6 months, a year is fine. Beyond that, I start to worry about how quickly you can keep up with a career once your debut is out.
I would say for me, it would probably be about 4 months. And if it's after that, then just don't include requested. Just remind me that it was through DVpit. But it would probably just have to go through my general query inbox.
And for me, it's about 6 months, because we might have acquired, you know, something that has a similar concept. Like if your book is baseball and we just acquired a baseball book 3 months later because we never got the other baseball book to compare it to. And it might be completely different. So it also just depends on where we're at that time.
Do you recommend that a manuscript be edited by a freelance editor before DVpit?
Only if they really feel like that's necessary for them. There are so many potential ways to get feedback on your manuscript that are free, like through your writing group. Go join your local SCBWI. Well, it's not exactly free to join SBWI, but I actually used to freelance edit, and several of the people that I worked with, it was exactly what they needed. And then they went on to get contracts, and several of them are New York Times bestsellers now. But that might not be what, it's a very personal thing.
If a book and character are set in the UK, but the author is American, does the story need to be written in British English, or does the agent, editor, copy editor take care of that?
I'll say from personal experience, I wrote a book with British characters in it, and it was published with Candlewick, and I did my best to get the Britishisms right, and I did a horrible job. And my UK editor with Walker Books came in at the copy edit level and said, okay, John, this should be university, and no one actually says this like this. And they made those changes sort of right at the last minute for copy edits. So that was my experience. I don't know if it's applicable across the board.
I think it probably depends on whether you've got a UK editor to do it.
That makes sense. How important is having an online presence before querying? Does having a website make a difference to agents and editors?
Not really, not for me. I mean, it's nice to see that you're on Twitter, but no, I mean, I don't know. I think only a couple of my authors actually have websites. So it didn't deter me from signing them as clients.
Same.
We like to see a robust online presence if that's your thing. But I don't think it's 100% required. If we do then acquire something, that's when we talk about, well, what do we need you to do before the book comes out?
What language use is acceptable when writing upper middle grade?
Do you mean like swearing and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that's what they meant by the question. Mm-hmm. Like what's too much, I guess, for the middle grade crowd?
I think probably no F-bombs, right? I mean, I would think of it like a PG-13 or PG movie, depending on the age range of the kids involved. And I think that regardless of whether or not it's realistic or not, I'm sure Stacy would agree, we're selling these books through to educational markets some of the time. And, I'm sure a lot of 13-year-olds drop F-bombs all the time. I know I did, but this doesn't mean it can really make it in the book.
I do think that it's possible to imply or state that somebody cursed without putting the curse on the page too.
That's true. Okay, so I tweeted about this today, actually, so it's really funny that we got this question. If an editor or agent likes a pitch during DVpit, but the author believes it would not be a good fit, how should they proceed?
Don't send it.
Yeah.
Especially if you get a lot of likes, I don't think that anybody's going to notice, because I don't think anybody's going to be going and tracking down that one pitch that never sent it in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I did DVpit, I made a list of the people who I would have queried anyway, and anyone who I didn't feel comfortable sending my stuff to, I just didn't. And I think that's important for writers to keep in mind. You don't have to send to everybody who requests, and only send to people who you would conceivably say yes to if they offered as well, because you don't want to waste an agent's time, and you don't want to waste your own time if you know you're not going to sign with that person. So great. So that was the speed round. We went pretty fast, I think, and now we're gonna take some questions from Twitter. Let's see. So this was actually on an agent's manuscript wish list, and somebody wants to know, what is non-linear dark YA? I don't know what that is. So,
what it is? What is it?
Yeah.
Well, non-linear is just a plot that is not told in a linear fashion. You might start at the end or in the middle and then flash back or flash forward.
So just dark YA with a plot that doesn't go in order, basically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's how I interpret that.
Okay. Here's a fun one. What are the biggest goofs someone can make during DVpit or pitching in general? I actually have one. Not using the hashtag for the event is a good one. Or something that one of my CPs did once, using the wrong hashtag for a different event. That was really funny. Or being a jerk on the hashtag. I've seen that too. People like started being mean or complaining or like saying mean things about agents. That's never a good idea.
I think if yeah, sort of moaning or complaining is sort of a turn off, even if we understand how you feel. You know, you want to do that with your friends, preferably in private.
Yeah.
You know.
That's what GChat is for.
Right.
How many genre or form hashtags would you say are too many on a pitch?
I think it depends on what you're writing. Definitely choose one age group. Don't say that it's both YA and middle grade, for example. I've seen that occasionally.
Right.
Pick one. Even if you think everybody will want to read it, you have to pick an age group.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, seeing hashtag DVpit and then hashtag YA or hashtag MG is really all it needs to be. Like, hopefully most of the genre is going to be conveyed by your pitch. You know, if it's got something fantastical in it, you know, I don't think you need to hashtag historical, paranormal, romance. You know, I think it can just be your idea plus the age range.
Okay. Let's see what else we have here. How do you, as an agent, know when a pitch / manuscript is the next big thing for you in general?
I wish I knew. I wish I had an answer for that.
Well, and that's the thing. The pitch is just the beginning. If I like a pitch, then I look at the submission. If I like the submission, then I look at the full manuscript. It's part of the process. I'm not just going to say, from that pitch, I know that is the one for me. I'm going to go acquire that right now.
I think if it sounds like something cool.
Yeah, same. And you never really know what's gonna hit with editors. So
Yeah.
it's always a gamble. So just whatever you're passionate about is what I say. That's what I look for. It is something I can be extremely passionate about.
So do you think authors that have already been published should concentrate on normal querying? Should they do pitch contests, or should they do a combination of both?
You mean published authors who might not necessarily have an agent?
Yeah.
I don't see what's wrong with doing both. I mean, you know, if I'm getting a query from a previously published author, I would definitely want them to tell me in the query, say like sort of, here's my publishing history or what I've done before. I don't know if you can fit that into a DVpit tweet, but I don't see why you can't, you know, use both of those avenues to find the right match.
Okay. This is a good one because I'm actually curious about this too. How can you let agents know in the pitch that the manuscript is multiple POV and doesn't just follow one character's life?
That's hard to fit.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not sure that if it's really something you're having a hard time fitting into your tweet, you might not need to put it in there. I don't know. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I don't know that a multi-POV is going to sway me one way or the other on a pitch. So if it's really hard to squeeze in, I would just go with those important details about your story. And then when I request it, hopefully, you know, you'll let me know in the query where you have much more space.
And I think it also depends on what your story is, because, for example, I could see pitching 3 teens do XYZ as, you know, that's your pitch. And that might imply, you know, main character plus 2 friends, but it might imply 3 points of view, and it gives a sense of the story, but it depends on what your story is about as well, as far as what your pitch will look like.
Okay. So I'm not sure if any of you would be able to answer this, but are there more picture books being considered with diverse family structures?
I know that we are actively looking for that at Lee and Low.
Okay.
I don't know about elsewhere, but that's something that we're actively looking for. Not me personally, because I do middle grade and YA, but take a look at the Lee and Low guidelines if that's something that you're interested in.
Okay. Perfect. So let's see. Okay, so many first-time writers can't afford editors to help them with their manuscript. So they rely on critique partners, self-editing, beta readers, etc. to help them. However, there may be cases where some errors still slip through the cracks. Do you have a certain amount of leniency when it comes to this, or would this be a complete rejection?
I mean, are you talking about just like typos and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think what they mean is like grammatical errors, probably, and typos.
I mean, I hope that it's as polished as can be, but if it's a good story, it's a good story, and I don't, unless it's like significant, like I'd say 50% of the manuscript has a bunch of typos and grammatical errors. If they're there here and there, it's not a big deal. But if it seems like this is something that you really should be learning how to kind of self-edit and see these things before you send your manuscript to someone, then that's a bigger issue. But if it's just minor things here and there, then it's not a big deal for me.
I would make a distinction between typos and grammatical errors. My tweets are always typo ridden. I'm the world's worst typo guy. So I have a lot of forgiveness for that. But I think when there's a usage error where it's clear that the author doesn't know how this particular part of speech is supposed to work, that I'm concerned with a little bit more, because that's not really a slip of the finger. That's that's a mistake in your understanding of your chosen medium, right? And a goof here or there is not a big deal. It wouldn't be an instant no. But if there are a lot of grammatical errors, I'd definitely be harsher on those than I would be on typos, little letters switched around or what have you.
I think it also depends on how readable your manuscript is with the errors. I have had submissions where there are a lot of typos, but it's still completely readable. It's just something that we're going to have to take care of. I mean, I have authors that have published more than 100 books who just sometimes just are full of typos, and I just have to, in the editing process, did you mean that word or did you mean this word? And usually they meant the other word because it was just working very fast and whatever. I think there's a big difference between that, and I've gotten submissions before where it was very obvious that the writer didn't know how to use a period. Like there was no punctuation, and it wasn't on purpose, a la The Road, or where everything was like 100 pages of no paragraphs. It was all one paragraph. That makes it impossible to read, and it just makes it hard for me to want to read more, because I'm having to edit it in my head. Is this what they really meant? So I think it just, like Quressa was saying, I think it just depends on how much of the manuscript is riddled with errors. I think, a few typos here and there, or misspellings, or, things that you just didn't catch, that's life. Everybody. I mean, I sometimes get people critiquing published books saying, I found one typo in your book. You can't be professional. Well, these things happen. We'll fix it in the reprint.
How long would you say it takes you to offer someone representation, to know when you want to offer someone representation?
Wait, what was the question? Can you repeat it again?
How long does it take you as an agent to decide whether or not you want to offer someone representation?
I mean, I usually know about, I'd say, halfway through the manuscript. If I feel like halfway, unless something goes completely off the rails by the end of the book, like if I'm at the halfway point and I still am loving it and I am excited about it and I want to tell like my husband and all my friends about it, and I know that it's something I want to offer rep on.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It usually happens really quick. Like I'm sort of already sold on it, you know, pretty early on, and I'm just reading to make sure that I'm not crazy and that, you know, it's not going to go off the rails. And even sometimes when it does go off the rails, I'm still too in love and I can't let it go. And that's when I might call the author and say, hey, this ending though, you know, what do you think about maybe reworking it with me? And that's worked out in the past. So yeah.
I would say that's probably about when if I'm still excited about it and I'm starting to talk about it in editorial meetings of, oh, I've got this thing that I'm not done with it yet, but I think it could be pretty good. That's usually, now in terms of how long it takes me to get to that point, it depends on what my other responsibilities are. So even though I'm excited about something, sometimes it takes me a long time to actually read it.
So is there anything in particular that you're all looking forward to finding in the next DVpit?
I really want some middle grade. I'm really actively looking, you know, both for sort of coming of age, you know, something sort of sweet and feelsy, and I would love an adventure or fantasy for that age group as well.
I've been saying I would love a diverse, fictional, Real Friends. If you've read Shannon Hale's Real Friends, middle grade with that sweet, just a everyday story kind of thing. Particularly, like I said earlier, we're looking for Muslim stories because it's just something that is a big gap in my list that I want to fill.
And I'm still looking for diverse cowboys and a fantasy set during the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, can I change my answer?
You know, when I watch Fantastic Beasts, that's all I could think of. Like, why is this not treating all Black people? It would have been amazing. I think we missed an opportunity with that big time. So if a writer has character art from like a beta reader, is it okay to include that in their pitch, or is that something you guys would like to see?
Character art that they drew or that someone else drew?
That someone else drew.
No, I wouldn't recommend it unless they were a professional illustrator that somehow they hooked up with somebody who's already a big name who loves their book so much that they want to be attached. But that's so rare that any kind of illustrations publishers prefer generally to match the author up with an illustrator if there's going to be illustrators. Save that for your Tumblr when you're like, my book is about to come out. Look what so-and-so made for me. I think that fan art and character art like that is really wonderful for Instagram and Tumblr and those kinds of things.
Agreed.
Okay. So we have one final question. So getting an offer of rep is overwhelming. How do you decide between multiple offers?
Oh, can't really answer that question for you. I mean, you have to talk to the agents, and it's kind of, it's a bit of a gut reaction, I think, of who you feel makes sense for you and your career and what you're looking for.
There are a lot of lists online of like questions you should ask an agent if they offer rep, and I'm blanking on some of the bigger ones right now, but they're out there if you Google them, and they're oftentimes really, really apt. And beyond the answers to those questions, I think it's just, like a personal connection. You know, do you feel like this person has a style that fits with yours? Some agents are editorial, some aren't, some are really communicative, some are sort of more all business, some are more personable in different ways. You know, so you want to find someone who kind of matches with you, you know?
Yeah, the questions that I used were from Jim McCarthy. He has a really good list.
That's,
yeah, I think I recommend that to like everyone who asks me. And getting multiple offers of rep is a lot less fun than what it sounds like. Like, it sounds really great, but it's actually the most stressful thing in the world, because the last thing you want to do is like tell people no. And when I went through it, I was like, I could never be an agent because I cannot reject people. It is horrible. I hated it. I cried. I was stressed out. But the thing that helped me ultimately choose was somebody asked me, if nothing happened with this current book, which agent would you feel happier with for your long-term career after this book, after, you know, if nothing happened with it, like for the rest of your career as a writer, who would you envision being the best agent for you? And that's what sort of helped me make the decision. But it is really, really hard, and it's like a lot less fun than what it sounds like. I mean, it's fun, but it's not as fun as what you think it is. It's also really it's really stressful also. So is there anything else that you guys want to let our audience know before we sign off?
Thank you for the great questions.
Yay! Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited for everyone to participate in DVpit, and we'll see you next time. See you on the timeline. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.